investigating yesterday's deadly terror attack. 8 people dead, a dozen hospitalized after a man drove a rented truck 20 blocks along a bike path, mowing people down as he went. 5 of the victims are Argentinian nationals. Officials say they were in town celebrating their 30th high school reunion.
The suspect in this case is 29-year-old Saifulo Saipov. He was shot by police after his rampage, and he's currently in critical condition. Police say he is from Uzbekistan and came to the United States in 2010. He has a Florida driver's license, but police say he may have been staying in New Jersey. Uber has also confirmed that he is one of the ride-sharing service drivers. Police say he rented the Home Depot truck used in the attack about an hour before his rampage. Witnesses on the scene recall the moments of panic and horror. Joining us now to shed some light on what might have driven the suspect to attack in such a way is Dr. Nancy Zarse. She is an expert in forensic psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Boy, that's a long title there.
Impressive.
First of all, thank you for coming in.
You're welcome.
We loved having you the last time when we talked about Stephen Paddock, but this case, you know, we talk about somebody who may have been radicalized, and it just goes against everything that we were just talking about in the break. Everything that we hear in the Western world, we just don't think like that. So how does somebody become like that?
Well, typically what we see is that these are individuals who have a need for status. They have a desire for vengeance. There's some kind of social reinforcement, and there's a pro-violence attitude. So again, these are people who decide that violence is a legitimate means by which to attain their objectives.
Okay, so that said, you know, impossible for you to get into this man's mind or anyone else's mind. These type of attacks, though, are becoming more prevalent. We've seen it in Germany, in France, in the UK. On a smaller scale attack like this, are there any signs that anyone who may have known this person or any of the other attackers might have noticed from a psychological standpoint, triggers that might make you say, wait a minute, this guy perhaps is dangerous?
Yes. Typically we do see what we call leakage, which are pre-incident indicators that there's a problem. So we would want to pay attention to things like movement from thought to action, where somebody is identifying with the use of violence, identifying with terrorists, justifying the use of violence. We often see that loss precipitates violence. So there might be a sudden change in health, mental health, relationship, finances, and this is a way that they see to address their grievances.
But, you know, to actually pull something off like this, you know, I think about some things that I don't really want to do. I get nervous. My blood pressure goes up. You know, I don't want to do this. And I got to imagine when you're about to pull the trigger or do something like this, you know, you got to have second thoughts. But apparently in some of these cases, well, obviously in this case, he doesn't. What goes through the mind of somebody who's planning this out, who thinks about it? Do they have time to reconsider?
Of course. Obviously and always you have time to reconsider. But there's what we call a process of moral disengagement, where people actually go through a process to disengage what you're referring to as your moral inhibition.
Right.
So there's things like they use euphemistic language. They blame the victims. They dehumanize the victims. They diffuse responsibility by saying, I'm part of a larger cause. They might identify with an ideology to make up for the fact that they feel a loss of personal identity. They don't have their own sense of identity, so they glam on.
We're learning more about this individual. He lived in Florida. He came here in 2010, and someone who knew him back then said he was a very happy person. I'm wondering, when it comes to radicalization, is it a question of good salesmanship? I mean, for lack of a better word, what is it in me that can convince you, who's come to America to live a better life, to enjoy our freedoms, to suddenly do a 180 and say, now I want to kill Americans?
Well, and what we find, Department of Homeland Security did a study, and they find that these folks typically are radicalized in America. They don't come as terrorists. They get radicalized here. So there are certain vulnerabilities. One of them is a loss of personal identity. They don't have their own sense. One of them is typically there's some kind of dysfunction. So this, in essence, fills a gap, and they become part of a larger social movement. And that social movement then tries to isolate them from the other influences that would work against something like this.
Like parents or family members that say, you don't do that.
You don't do this. Yes, there's other ways to address grievances. There's legitimate ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we talked about him, but let's talk about the people who live in New York City. I mean, we know New Yorkers went through 9/11 and other incidents as well, bombings, and they're pretty resilient. But, you know, people around the country hear this and they get nervous. They don't want to go out on the jogging path. They don't want to go on the bike path. So what do you say to them?
Well, first of all, let's look at what makes terrorism so scary. And the terror of terrorism is its sense of uncontrollability, its sense of unpredictability, and the gravity of the consequence, combined with the fact that it's malevolent. This isn't loss of life due to an act of nature. This is deliberate humans working against humans. So part of what we need to do is focus more on the resilience than the terrorism. Because their goal, the target isn't the actual victims. The target is the public and our resilience.
Put fear in our minds.
Right. And then we lose faith in our government, in military and law enforcement, and so we change. That's what we want to work against. So some of the characteristics of resilience include intelligence, creativity, humor, coping strategies, and social skills.
Positive thinking?
Correct. Yes. And optimism.
And optimism.
A sense of hope is actually a characteristic of resilience.
Yeah, we can focus on the bad, or we can focus on how good that
and
police
celebrate
officer
life.
is.
Yes, we mourn, but let's celebrate life.
Right, right. And then that police officer, he did such a great job.
Fabulous.
And you know, look at that as a positive.
And look at the New Yorkers. The parade went on, and the kids were trick-or-treating.
Right.
And Dr. Zarse, thank you so much. And to her point, despite the violence, New Yorkers could not be deterred from going to the big annual Halloween parade. Folks dressed up in costumes. They took to the streets in unity. Just to her point, both the governor and mayor walked in this parade as planned. And right now, global leaders, community activists, and world icons gathering. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's with Joni Lum. So anyway, to that point, folks living their lives.
And here in Chicago, we had our own parade, you know, in Boys Town, where we just said, you know, we're still doing our thing. And I love that.
Think Winston Churchill. Think Winston Churchill out in the ruins after the bombings of World War II, saying, be calm and carry on. We shall never surrender. And the only thing to fear is fear itself. All of those concepts apply right now.
I like the way you think. Thank you very much,
Appreciate
Nancy.
Dr. Nancy Zarse. All right, now let's send it to Mike Kaplan.
All right, yes, storms.